Go means go.
Go
Hello.
means go.
Hey, Jen.
Hi, Bess. How are you?
I'm living. I'm existing in a world with children.
How is the new home?
It's going well. It has been a struggle. If anyone has raised children and knows a good way to get them to unpack, I'm not asking for parenting advice, but maybe just on that one topic. No, we are, that's the only pain point in our home right now, is that our children both want a nicer room and don't want to do it themselves. But I refuse to unpack for a 9 and 11-year-old. So it goes slowly. But the rate at which the adults have made all of the common spaces and adult rooms look in the last month pleases me greatly.
That's great. I would just put all those boxes in the attic. They obviously don't need them.
We don't have an attic. We live in Florida. There's no basements and there's no attics.
Mm.
Oh my gosh, the most Southern sounding. My younger child has a Southern accent. People may or may not know this. The older child does not. But last Christmas, she's just like, I don't know where all these lights come from because you can't put them in the basement.
Oh my God.
And we quote that all year round. So that's what my kid sounds like. And it's okay. Their room has come a long way this weekend. We just have had to negotiate how much unpacking you get to do before we do something fun. And that works.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that works.
This is boring.
When we moved here, Susie was 4 and she would do no unpacking. But her favorite video game to play was the unpacking game, in which you unpack boxes. She still loves that game. She's on her 3rd playthrough.
My children love to play a game where you manage a gas station.
Perfect. The games are too much. The games are too much. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for the update. I've loved the pictures of your studio.
Thank you. Can we talk about something more fun? How's it going with the tank? Last week we talked all about the tank.
We talked all about the tank. I finished it, and now I'm knitting a second one because I feel like something simple has to be perfect. Listen, I've watched enough Great British Bake Off to know. If you're going to do a simple recipe, it has to be absolutely impeccably executed, right? So that's where I am.
No
with the
soggy
tank.
bottoms.
No soggy bottoms. Yeah. And the first version, it was a little long for my taste.
Did you feel like the bottom was soggy? The bottom felt a little soggy, right? It was a little
bottom.
too much bottom.
Too much bottom.
Because, getting like the ease and the length and everything right with something with so much drape, I think is really important because silk just doesn't, there's no loft. So if the ease is not right with the length, or if the length is too much, it just starts pooling. You just start getting fabric everywhere, which maybe is what you want, or maybe
and
it's
I wanted
not.
to play a little bit with the underarm depth. This is one of my first times designing for plant, and I'm lumping silk in there, even though we know it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm designing for those fibers first, right? This is more your wheelhouse, so it might take me a little experimentation to get things as perfect as I want them.
I still have to experiment sometimes because even in the world of silks are very different. And whereas with wool, I nearly always size down when I'm doing my I-cord edging. With silk, sometimes I actually have to size up. Sometimes I have to size down more than I would have. It's a lot of variance because silk can be like milled so differently.
Yeah, and wool has a lot of bounce, right? So in the neckline, you'll knit it just like 2 rows of rib, and then it's a sewn tubular bind off, just enough to make it look really nice. Mm-hmm. The silk that I'm using is a raw silk, which is also known as silk knoll or silk barrette. We talked a little bit about this before.
Okay.
And it's a little splitty, right? So there was no way that I could successfully execute like a really nice I-cord edge tension, right? Like it's so tight, you can't figure out which stitch is which on the needle. So I wanted to do a sewn tubular bind off. It's very pretty, but I did end up putting a note in the pattern. Listen, like plant and silk fibers don't have bounce. They aren't forgiving like wool. So you need to monitor the way that your stitches and your stitch gauge and rib is coming out here in a way that you might not have to if you're making this out of wool.
That is, main caveat. If you do work with silk often, the only thing that really can trip me up is applying the edging. Sometimes I have to do it more than once. Can you believe that? It has been a perfectly sunny day, and the moment we started recording now, all of these clouds are rolling in and out, and my lighting is like going insane. So anyway, just my weekly acknowledgement of how subpar my podcast tech is.
We're getting there, one thing at a time.
Just remind me to use my light next time.
Moving on. I'm using a yarn from a dyer called Wonderland Yarns, and it's a really nice silk, and it's described as a fingering weight. It's 390 yards per 100 grams, which to me is fingering, but like I'm knitting it on 5s, and girl, it's a sport. It's a sport weight yarn.
Okay. This is something I think happens a lot with silk and other plant fibers because they behave differently in the strand than wool. So 390 per 100 grams to me is a heavy fingering weight, right? Because like a true fingering weight to me is like 440. Maybe that's a little fine, but it's what I work with a lot. So that's just my life. I have seen fingering weights listed as fingering weight even up to like 550, which really is getting to be lace. But actually this is like I think this might be 115 grams skein though.
Yeah.
Important note.
Yeah, that makes
but this is still a fine fingering weight. But like the silk, if it's applied silk, right, then I feel like the plies don't stick together as much in silk as they do in wool, making a fatter stitch. The silk I just used in the Kano tee is listed as sport, but it has like 570, I think, per 100 gram, 540 per 100 gram. But it's a single ply silk, and it's like very thick and thin. It doesn't really look a ton thick and thin in knitted in stockinette, but while you are knitting, but while you're knitting with it, you feel that it is. That's also a knoll silk. And
they're the same. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but the construction of the construction of the yarn is not the same. So I think that makes a difference. But my silk, which was listed as sport, really knit to more of a fingering weight gauge. It's like 26 stitches and 40 rows, which is the same as this fingering weight wrap sweater.
Yeah. And my fingering weight is definitely a sport. I have made 11 swatches because, we're designers. We want to make sure that people can create our garments. And I think that if somebody wants to sub it, I have yet to find a fingering that will work. And DK cotton is too heavy. So I think they'll need a sport blend to successfully substitute this. But the yarn that this is available in a lot of shops and is available, like you can order it on their website, and it's like a 2 or 3 week turnaround. So it's a broadly available yarn, even if it's not as easy to substitute as some of our other projects would be.
Yeah. And so I kind of said to you about this when we were talking about choosing a yarn, because you almost went with a different yarn so that you would be able to swap it more easily. I believe out there in the budget market, there's actually a lot of really good swaps for plant fibers, including silk and cotton. There are a lot of bamboo cotton or bamboo blends that behave a lot like silk. And you can find them in sport weight. You can find many different weights. It's a little harder in more of the luxury market to swap a sport weight plant yarn because it's a niche. I mean, for a while, sport weight in general was hard to find because it's like a US thing.
I feel like we're single-handedly carrying the sport market.
I mean, it is one of our favorite weights to use. I end up using fingering weight the most, but a lot of times I look for sport weight first. And if I can't find a yarn that feels like the right one, then I end up in fingering weight because there's so many more options. Yeah. But because of that, I've seen the market growing in the world of sport weight yarn.
Same. Yeah.
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 So I think there's more options than it might seem like. And yeah, then there's always going with the same yarn. But we're talking about this a bit because we've got a question recently. And this is what happens when I pull the questions, is that like I suck and I don't write down your name and I don't write down the exact question. And so that's the best half of this partnership. But we saw this question someone asked us recently about gauge. And essentially the question is this, like, if you can't get gauge on a pattern that you're working from, what do you do? And at what point is it not worth it to you? And if it is worth it to you, you know, what are your tips for doing that? And we have an episode about gauge, episode 12, if you want to listen to us talk for like an hour and a half. But we're going to answer these kind of exact questions a little more succinctly now. So Jen, presuming we're knitting someone else's pattern, because designers get to set the gauge when we design, but when you're knitting someone else's pattern, what is the point for you where you're like, no, I can't do this? What's the process that you go through to decide if your swatch that isn't gauge, but is the fabric you want and the yarn you want, like, what is too much?
When I don't like the fabric.
Mm-hmm. So you would do all the maths again if you needed to.
Yeah, it's just math.
Yeah. But we have the skill to do that because we know how to design a garment and like how to design a hand knit garment. Before I had that wheelhouse, I think the answer would really be like, it depends how much of that math I need to change. And it depends also on like how comfortable I would have been with that construction. How easy is it to make the changes I need to make? So
yeah, so a lot of the times Sunny has come into the room. So if your door
Sunny has entered the chat.
Sunny has entered the chat. I wrote a blog post on this actually, and let's link to it in the comments so that people who are not auditory learners can check that out. Often the first thing I'll do is assuming that the fabric that I've created is similar to the ones in the pattern. Like it has the same properties, has the same weight, drape, bounce. It's just a different stitch count or row count. What I will often do is I will start by picking out key measurements in the pattern and seeing what I'll get. Right. So if I know that the circumference is 44 inches and my stitch is 15% larger than the one called for in the pattern, what's 15% of 40 inches? Do I like that? Right. And so I'll look at key widths. Yes. Like wrist, upper arm, hip, bust. But I'll also look at the yoke depth and the sleeve cap depth and make sure that I will have enough room for my body. Yeah. And not too much. So if those key measurements work out, sometimes I'll just be like, do I like that garment as much as I like the silhouette of the original? And that's a lot of like what I did with the pluses Gansey, right? It's like, crunch the numbers. What do you get? Is it good? Okay. Have fun knitting that. Right. I would probably not try and recreate I would probably not regrade a whole pattern.
No, not if you have to do all of it. You might as well just make your own from scratch.
But I might make tweaks to some of the depths because it feels to me like row gauge is usually the thing that we struggle with. And for folks who haven't yet experimented with this, just so you know, often stitch gauge will remain consistent when you change needle lengths, even if row gauge does not.
Yeah. So when someone tells me they can't get gauge, or if I'm saying I can't get gauge, it's assumed that I've made like 6 swatches because you might swatch and be like, oh, I've got stitch gauge, but my row gauge is off. I can't get gauge. That's not necessarily true. If you try several needle sizes, like up and down, whichever way you need to go, and you really can't get gauge, then you really can't. And that's okay. Not all yarn is shaped in the same shape. But I would do the same thing as Jen. Like I would look at Another way of mathing it, which gives you the same answer, is like, what is my stitch gauge per inch? What is my row gauge per inch? How can I pull out the numbers that equate, to the armhole or to the body? If I know that like the pattern is written at 4.5 stitches per inch, and then you have 44 inches at the bust, you can multiply that if it's hard to find those exact numbers. Anyway, I would do the math. I would grab the row counts and the widths of those key measurements. And if you're not comfortable with schematics and figuring out these kinds of things, check out our class schedule. We do have classes coming up that will help reading a schematic, judging a pattern, that are going to give you some tools and walk through this process with patterns.
Totally.
But I would see, one, can I switch sizes? Can I go up a size or down a size? It's harder to do that when you're at the ends of the size range like I am, because there's only, limited sizes that are smaller than me. If I need to go down, I might size out of that option. Someone might size up from that option, but you can still see, is there a size available at my gauge that will give me a similar result? Or if not, like what exactly do you have to do? Do you have to add 4 inches to the entire thing, and where are those inches going to go, and how much redistributing of all of the increase? Like, to simplify, how much of the shaping am I going to have to fuck with? I don't want to have to fuck with that much shaping. I don't mind adding an inch to the armhole and an inch to the body, whatever. That's pretty easy to stick into an area that doesn't have a lot of shaping, especially like a set-in sleeve, which we all know is my favorite. But, if I'm looking at a raglan and I need to change like a bunch of widths and a bunch of depths, and I need to like rewrite that whole raglan, then no, I don't want to do that. That feels like a lot of work. I would either switch to yarn.
A raglan feels like half the work of a set-in sleeve.
Well, but that just shows our preference.
Yeah. But I think it's good to say that part out loud, because some people have in their mind that different constructions are inherently harder, and it could just be your experience with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, how much work do you have to do, and how comfortable are you doing that work? Everything is just an experiment, but I understand like no one wants to make something knowing it's not going to work out.
And there are things that we do on the design side to make sure that y'all will have greater success, right? So like one of the things I always do is I ensure that the stockinette gauge that I'm getting is reasonable, right? So we know that there should be a certain relationship between stitch row and stitch and row height and width. So that should be around 67, 71 in that range %, right? Stitches are short and wide in stockinette. So if it's not, then I start to say, have I blocked this wrong, or is this going to be a difficult yarn to sub for? So that's one thing that we can do, is we can run those checks and make sure that we're using a yarn that is going to give you a gauge that's achievable. The other thing, and this is something I've done with Breaker here, is if pieces are using different stitch patterns, seaming them gives you a better chance to have success. Because just because you get my stockinette gauge doesn't mean you'll get my ribbon gauge, doesn't mean you'll get my texture gauge. So, this garment, one of these pieces is 2 rows shorter than the other, but they're the same length, so they seam together. And so when you are making yours, if you have a different gauge than I have, you're not going to end up with something that balloons along this seam because your row gauge is longer, right? You'll be able to seam them together and have success with that. And I've used that strategy a couple of times, right? I've used it here, I've used it in forest finds, but everybody knits different things at different tension. And just because you get my gauge with one size needle for one thing doesn't mean you're going to get it across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that a seamed garment is easier to deal with your gauge being slightly off because you're able to block more precisely. And when you're able to block more precisely, you actually have a lot more wiggle room than you might think in what that final gauge is. Like, we never want to aggressively stretch something out of shape to block it. But a lot of times I'm like patting my knitting into place to block it, which means I could have padded that, that garment into a slightly different shape just as easily. I could have blocked it slightly bigger or smaller. So seamed garments do actually, it always feels counterintuitive, but they do give you a lot more wiggle room to make changes without making as many mistakes. Yeah. But I had a thought and then it left me. Oh, another thing that we do as designers to try and help y'all, have success with Gauge, in One Wild Patterns, we will really describe the yarn a lot. Some designers do this more or less so that you understand the characteristics of that yarn, so that you know what is going to give you the most similar fabric. And as we were talking about, like with Jen's tank design and other designs we've done in the design house, we do consider, like, can you swap for this? There are not a lot of occasions where we think this is going to be hard to substitute, but I'm going to do it anyway. There may be situations where we feel like that because we are really passionate about a project. This yarn that Jen is talking about might be a little harder to swatch for or to sub for, but I don't think it's going to be that hard. It might be hard to find like the exact same kind of content and put up, but you can find a yarn that will knit to that gauge and behave similarly, like a wool silk sport weight blend, which is a lot more common.
I also think you could hold some things together and get a really beautiful result.
Yeah. And the most important swaps for me are like, are there budget friendly swaps for this expensive yarn that I'm using? That's more important to me than like, are there other expensive yarns that people can buy? But I do want, all price ranges to be fairly available for people. But like with your tank, we really talked about several times, like changing the yarn maybe, but at the end of the day, the fabric that is created, the overall ease of knitting that fabric at the weight of this yarn is worth keeping this yarn. And
it's a tank top, right?
Yeah.
Like, we've seen some shawls out there that might be $600 projects. Like that feels different to me than somebody who's going to spend $50 for a finished project. That's a yarn I recommend.
Well, my Tori tank that I released with Body of Work is knit with Pearl Soho Cattail silk, which is a mulberry silk. And so that's like a fine silk. It is a super fine yarn. It's like reasonably priced for one skein, but if you needed like 8 skeins, it would be an expensive project, right? But to knit Tori, I don't think any size uses more than 3 or maybe 4 skeins, which, was one of the reasons that I was like, well, there aren't a ton of exact same yarns, but there are a lot of similar yarns that just might not be the exact same composition or whatever, right? Or this is a widely available yarn that is a reasonable knitting project budget, especially compared to like a sweater or something.
Yeah. And honestly, like a tank is a really easy thing to do exactly what we already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
See what you're going to get and adjust the length. You don't have to deal with sleeves. The pickup rate is 1-to-1 all the way around the trim. So that's really easy to adjust. It's not like you have to do much. And it's a little trim, so there's no shaping in the trim. So you don't have to worry about the counts. It's just make sure it's an even number and you're good. Yeah.
Yeah. Which makes it really nice. So I hope that answers this question about what we do with Gauge. I mean, I want an easy knitting experience when I'm knitting someone else's pattern, and I will usually just make sure that I can get Gauge, honestly, with whatever yarn I choose and whatever pattern I choose. But I am in no short supply of patterns I want to knit, and I have no short supply of yarn available. So I have the privilege of being able to be like, this isn't a match, and move on. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I love also that we got a chance to talk about like some of our values here with substituting and making sure that we have good transparency on what that process looks like.
Yeah, we do. I like when we share a little more about behind the scenes, because I will say before I became a designer, I had absolutely zero idea of like what that was like. And there's a lot more transparency in our industry than there used to be. So I hope that continues.
Yeah. I know some people will list alternate yarns. Usually you and I are in a business relationship with another small business, and that doesn't feel like a good match for us. But like, honestly, I feel like making like the work that we're doing to make sure that somebody can have success with the pattern serves that point, if not better, right? Listing the qualities of the yarn and the properties of the yarn, trying it out to make sure that we can get those substitutions, and then writing patterns that are more flexible for gauge and giving you all the measurements that you need to make that assessment. It is a lot of work, but we really want people to be successful with these patterns, and that's what has to be done.
Well, yeah, I would much rather empower people to be able to sub whatever yarn they want to sub than list like 5 other yarns that could be a good fit and assume that you want to work with one of those. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, if you live in another country, if whatever, right? If like this first yarn isn't available, how do I know that these other ones are for you?
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's, teach a knitter to fish.
Yeah. Not have a smelly, fishy sweater.
Exactly. Give a knitter a fish and they'll just have a smelly, fishy dinner one time.
New t-shirts. Here they come.
We're going to have to tell the FBC to make these t-shirts.
All right, Lady Pants.
That's it. That's our episode. We are still working on getting a higher frequency of episodes, but you will notice we're not there yet.
Not there yet.
We'll get there soon.
Holidays.
Maybe before the holiday or maybe not. Yeah. Listen, we're trying to make things magical for our children and stuff.
Ask me later about the elf.
Oh, do you do the elf on the shelf?
Okay, so
I'm asking
Susie
you
came
now.
home and she's like, some people have elves that come to their house every night. And I'm like, we don't.
We're not on that plan.
We're not on that train. And she's like, but maybe you could do it a few times and we could pretend. And I was like, I could do it a few times and we could pretend. She's like, great, I'll get the calendar. So I do about 4 a year. It's fine. It's cute. She loves it. All she really wants me to do is put it in cute poses and not tell her about it. And like, honestly, I'm up to the challenge.
Yes, that feels okay. But
yes,
let me tell you, as a young 20-year-old yoga teacher, watching my clients at 6 a.m. go, oh shit, I forgot to move the fucking elf and run around the house.
It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be like
we
that.
don't do that. No, we don't do
this
that.
year, that was last year that she said that. And this year, she's like, Maves moves every day. I was like, why do you think that is? And she's like, I think her parents do it. And I was like, maybe. So we're getting to be a
Candace was
certain age.
raised a Jehovah's Witness. So she had no Christmas.
No magic.
No magic. So to her, no Harry Potter allowed. Not that we promote Harry Potter as the number one magical most thing. It's not. Anyway, moving on from that topic. It was a different time.
Yeah.
It was a different time. There's other magic available for children.
Yes.
However, Candace wasn't allowed to have it for other less social justice related reasons. So it's like she got to choose which kind of traditions she would adopt for the children, since we do celebrate holidays here. But we don't have to do any of the things.
Right.
So it's kind of nice. It's kind of a nice in between. We like the tree, but elves don't exist to us.
We're not doing it. We don't do anything surveillance-y. Let's put it that way. There's no threatening. There's no cajoling. There's no reporting to the North Pole in my house of any kind.
No. Yeah, there's no removing gifts, threatening your children with not having gifts.
No. There's an elf and a hot air balloon.
Withholding love for normal child behavior.
Right. Cool. Well, now that we've discussed all of our other values.
I already told the podcast that I'm the kind of parent that holds my 11-year-old's hand and is like, listen to this 17-minute folk song with me and weep. So I don't think any of this should come as any surprise.
No.
So anyhow,
So when we're done making candy cane sleds for non-moving elves, we'll record some extra episodes.
Oh, and by the way, I'm making your hot chocolate recipe this week for my family. We'll report back.
It's so good.
Yeah. I'm really nervous about having chocolate scrambled eggs.
Have you not tempered eggs before? Okay.
No, I didn't even know what that meant.
Yeah. Yeah.
I read that.
And if you have leftovers, add an extra cup of milk and some chia seeds. And
yes.
Breakfast pudding.
Yes, I like that. I have chia seeds available.
Right? They don't use themselves either, it turns out. You have to actually put them into things.
You buy a pound of those for $50. Like, I can't afford to do this regularly, but it turns out you don't have to because you'll never use them.
That's it. You're good. You're sorted. You're done. All right. Well, I will talk to you then.
Yeah. So many values revealed in this episode. Everyone, happy knitting. Thank you for joining us. Keep your questions coming, please. They really inspire us.
They make our lives easier. Give us those questions.
Bye-bye.